Hello, Frederica. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
I am so looking forward to this conversation. And we've been talking for about half an hour before we even hit record. And there is so much for us to talk about. Where I'd like to start, we were talking about the idea of calling at some point in our conversation so far. And so I'd love to start with how you were called to do the not exactly average job that you now find yourself doing.
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. I actually love talking about this. I love tracing back the threads that have resulted in me being where I am. So when I think back on the sort of origins of this whole journey, I think back to a childhood where I was always fascinated by the big questions in life and was also always drawn to these like overlapping spheres of ecology, like nature connection, and of spirituality, of religion. And I was just sort of drawn to both. I would, where I wanted to play and like the creek and the woods around my house. And as a young person feeling really compelled to participate in like the rites and rituals of the Catholic Church. And later on, some, more kind of toxic expressions of that tradition that I have since spent a while recovering from. But all along, it's been like these two prongs. It's been like nature and the world of spirituality. And alongside that has been this constant fascination with like, how does change happen? How does transformation happen? How does an individual, like, how do I change and grow and evolve and mature? But also how do like groups and societies evolve and transform and change? I think part of this is like the lens I bring to the world through the Enneagram, which I've always been fascinated by, which is like, how can things be better? How can things be improved? But so this for me evolved into kind of formal study and personal practice of both those things, formally studying environmental science and ecology, formally studying religion, and getting more into kind of like personal explorations and practices of both participating in different expressions of that and experimenting with different ways of being in the natural world, contemplative ways, recreational ways. And, it was like a dabbler. I just kept dabbling in it. And they finally came together at the end of college. So I was sort of studying both of these. These were my twin interests. And I realized before long that they began speaking to one another. And what I realized I had a fascination by was the way in which the kind of dominant, like hegemonic religious tradition of any place, which in my context is Christianity, this sort of dominant religion, whether one practices it or not, or adheres to it or believes in its tenets, how that influences us all subconsciously. And in particular, I got really excited about how it affects our relationship to the natural world. Like, what are parts of this religious tradition that are influencing how I am relating to this world around me? So I kind of dove into a study of this. And this was the beginning of a long, professional journey of sort of trying on different hats and costumes, of trying to understand that disconnection between humans and the natural world that we see all around us, and we see expressions of that all around us, and then creating conditions for transformation, for changing, for addressing that. And I tried this on in the classroom as a college professor with my undergraduate and graduate students. I got into this in like activist spaces with sort of marching in the streets. I got into this with contemplative practices, working with advanced spiritual professionals. And in this kind of long, windy, fun path, it started bumping up against psychedelics. I think many people, especially in this current expression of the so-called psychedelic renaissance, are coming at this from a mental health perspective, or maybe a legal perspective, public health, psychology, pharmacology, maybe business. Like, those are the avenues that are getting the most attention and that the pathways that are opening up. For me, it has always been from a spiritual angle, this fascination of the plants as an entheogen, right? Like as a material that can induce an altered awareness so that we come into contact with the divine. And so for me, it was always like, how might this be a tool, not the tool? I don't think there is a single tool, but how is this a tool for healing this disconnection consciousness that we see all around us, that have so many expressions, And the expression I'm most interested in is this disconnection from the natural world. So about a year ago, I took on a position as the director of a psychedelic practitioner training program that over 300 students have been enrolled in since it launched. And I get this opportunity all the time to sort of explain how I got here. And every time the story is a little different, but this is the one that came out today.
Oh, I love that so much. I really love that. I was kind of waiting for the moment where those two strands got brought together, and I got chills when they did. It's like, I remember, wasn't that long ago. As you'll know, the sort of shamanic worldview is very much an animus worldview, which is very much the two strands coming together. They're not even separate. And I had a podcast guest who comes from, I guess, a form of indigenous magic recently, and he said something that's really stayed with me. And he said, it isn't that, he didn't say it quite like this, me paraphrasing, but it isn't that animism is like the original human view. It's the innate human view. And when he said that, I was just like, oh wow, that's changed something for me.
Yeah.
Like, that's actually the default that we kind of like learn away from.
Yeah.
And it's since I heard him say that, it's like I recognize, like, one way or another, like we're like those of us in this kind of work, it's a return to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just peeling back all the layers that have calcified around that innate understanding. I love that way of thinking of it.
Wonderful. Well, I your story is a really magical one. So again, coming to this idea of calling, I've seen on my own journey, like, it's so interesting how we can think that we're the ones in charge. We can think it's kind of, like, oh, I'm in charge of this. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing that. And then more and more, speaking personally, but also whether it be people in my shamanic circle, whether it be our clients, whether it be people on the podcast that got stories like you, I'm like, so interesting how it almost sometimes feels as though the story began way back when in childhood. And then it's like, at some point we kind of catch up with it and go, oh, something different was going on than I expected.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would love to hear your thoughts on having, we've kind of started somewhere I wasn't expecting to, but I'd love to start here because I think people listening to this, probably they're listening to it because one way or another, they are feeling some kind of call towards, working as guides, change workers, maybe specifically with psychedelics. What have you seen around this idea of the call to this kind of work?
Oh, yes. I love this. This is so rich and I'm so excited to talk about it. Maybe let me offer the listeners a little bit of context about the way that this training program exists at the company that I'm with and how it came about. And I think that will like lead us into this rich conversation of like, what does it even mean to get trained, right? To get certified, to heed this calling. So this training program that I direct, that I'm part of ushering into the world, was designed and operated by a company called the Synthesis Institute. And for those listeners who are in sort of psychedelic spaces or have been following news there, this might ring a bell. The Synthesis Institute has gone through some really major shifts in the last few months. That is sort of an understatement. A lot of people have been pretty personally impacted by what happened. So I'm going to speak about this with some sensitivity. But the Synthesis Institute was actually two organizations. There was a retreat organization in the Netherlands focused on offering psychedelic retreats. And then there was a training program, a digital kind of global training program, which operated online. And the retreats presented over 1,000 different people, went through these 5-day kind of bespoke retreats using truffles containing psilocybin. And what emerged pretty quickly was that there was a need for more retreat guides who are trained in safe, ethical, and in the case of this company, legal facilitation of psychedelic ceremonies. So the company began offering a training program. The retreat side of the business was never actually profitable. It's tough to be profitable in this space, and it's a really volatile field. And so the inevitable happened, and that part of the company went bankrupt pretty recently, and closed down earlier this year. It was a big shakeup. A lot of the staff was laid off, but the training program, fortunately, has been able to continue. So it's sort of weathered a storm. It's now operated by a company called Retreat Guru. Most of the students have stayed on, some have left, some staff have returned. The faculty and curriculum remains intact. And what's so interesting is, as I reflect back on all this that's happened, it has come up over and over and over again that what we all went through kind of felt like a bit of like a corporate brutal psychedelic journey. And we're now in like the post journey, like integration phase of like what happened? How do we make sense of that? What are the questions that we ask ourselves? And if you want to, we can sort of get into, some of like the shadow side of psychedelic companies in this current age. But I think what might be more interesting to talk about is like, what is this idea of someone who's sort of feeling called to get into this work? What does it look like to gain the tools and skills that are considered, essential to responsibly get into this work? So, there's ways you get educated and there's ways you get trained. And I think those are different. They're different in some important ways. But I think anyone who's feeling called, so to speak, that can be a loaded word, but who's sort of feeling this urge to work in some kind of a formal or professional capacity, maybe one-on-one, to help others grow spiritually or experience inner healing. There are a lot of options out there. There's a whole world, there's a whole rich marketplace full of options to kind of like sharpen our tools, right? To like hone these tools that are needed to be with others. So, what can I say about this one? It's been very thoroughly and meticulously designed over many years by a lot of just wonderful, brilliant people that I had the opportunity to work with. And this program walks students through 9 modules, and the first 4 are really foundational. And I've noticed students can often be frustrated because they're like, I want to get into the stuff where it's like, how do I guide? What happens after they take the mushroom? Like, what do we do? But we take our time getting there because there's some foundational aspects that are super, super important. So we begin by like meeting the mushroom. We just like meet and encounter this substance and like it's like, you're encountering someone and it's like, what are you like? What am I like? Let's begin a relationship. We get pretty deep into ethics and shadow. We get into trauma and what it means to be trauma informed in this space. You could spend years and years and years working on that. We touch on it because it's important. And we also really get into the pedagogy of this training program before we really get into the preparation, the ceremony itself, integration, screening, all of that stuff. And the pedagogy, I think, is one of the things that makes us different than a lot of the different ways that one can get trained. And synthesists recognized pretty early on that there is no single right way to do this. That there is so much that we don't know. We just have to begin with we don't know almost everything. We will probably continue to not know almost everything, and trying to avoid that performance of knowledge. But instead embracing there are so many ways to know and understand what is going on with the mushroom and with psychedelics. And so it embraced this idea of let's pick 4 different lenses and let's show up in this training program and approach the content through these 4 different lenses each time, 1 a week for a month. And we will put ourselves kind of at the center of it with our curiosity, our vulnerability, our humility, but accepting that there is a lot of different approaches. And so the first one in every module is embodied wisdom. And it's what do we know from our body? This is the space where we sort of cultivate ongoing somatic, spiritual self-reflection practices examine personal ethics, articulate personal values. And it's like a space of deep integration of everything that you learn from the other lenses, because as you know so well, like this all has to find a home in our bodies. The second lens is cognitive wisdom. And this is like everything we understand with our brain, everything that's knowable through study and observation and thought. And if you, like me, grew up in an educational system that was fairly traditional, like this is the only kind of knowledge or intelligence that's really valued primarily in our society. It's like, can you reflect, if you're considered smart and intelligent, if you can reflect back cognitive wisdom, like in an intelligible way. And we appreciate it and recognize it, but it's one of many. So this is where it's like, what are the contributions of history and philosophy and science and all of this rich science going on right now to our modern day understanding of psychedelics? So like, let's get into neuroscience, let's get into psychopharmacology, let's get into harm reduction best practices. And then we move into the sacred wisdom lens. And this is like all the ways that people make meaning in their lives, including spiritual, philosophical, nature-based, wisdom-based approaches that many, many cultures have developed long before and, in parallel with modern scientific thinking. And then finally, it all culminates with this sort of relational wisdom, which is like, how do you build relational skills? What's the role you want to play with clients and in the psychedelic community? How can we be deliberate and intentional in our work as facilitators? And so, this pedagogy I've learned over the, year plus that I've been here has ended up being like a real draw for a lot of students who recognize that like all of these are important ways to approach a study of and a training in preparing to be a psychedelic guide, and that there's kind of like almost moral obligation to do the work, to do this work in integrity. Like you kind of got to approach it from all kinds of different angles and recognize like there is no one way. There is no sort of one approach to mastery of it. So that's a little bit about the framework for this training, and an interesting conversation that's been happening all along. And I want to give a shout out here to my former colleague, Don Kamen, who was one of several voices in the company that was always, reminding us, like bringing this up, being like, are we a training or are we an educational, is this like an educational, foundational, like this is really important, good stuff that you ought to know, but are you in fact getting trained to be a practitioner? And can you be trained if this doesn't include, hands-on, long period of like embodied hands-on practice? And so this was like a really rich conversation that was always at work, because I think there was kind of consensus like that hands-on practicum experience is essential. And how do you do that? How do you do that if it's an online digital training that's also committed to operating legally, and there are so few, legal outlets to practice and kind of dive into this. So like very, very rich conversations. And another kind of thread that was always surfacing throughout this was like, well, what do you, in the end, what do you end up with? You end up with a certificate, right? With a piece of paper that says, you've completed this training program that is rigorous, it's well respected, that has some like clout in the field. And also at the end of the day, like it invites some real careful consideration and thinking of like how does anyone consider themselves ready for this kind of work, right? For this kind of like this work where, so I've picked up on conversations happening in a few different related fields around this idea of like credentialing and certification. I've heard this coming up a lot in midwifery. There's a woman online named Kiddist who has a thing called the womb room, and does some really, really interesting thinking around the way that credentialing may sort of be more about like control than about safety. And I've also noticed this happening like in some conversations around like backcountry guiding and mountaineering, how much if you're going to go up a mountain with a guide, like do you want someone who's been through like an accredited guide training certification, or do you want someone who's been doing this for like 20 years and may not have that credential? And I just think it's a fascinating space to dive into, like the lived experience, mentorship, apprenticeship path versus like the credential, the certificate, the degree. I mean, I think ideally like you're marrying them, you're bringing them both together, but I think it's important to tease apart what each path is offering.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all of this, and it brings to mind what you were saying there about those 4 different ways of knowing, where we've so prized the cognitive, which to a large extent is probably an overlay with this kind of accreditation view of this is what you need, and can very much ignore the other kinds of learning and experience, which certainly to me, I'm not going to necessarily say are more important, but they're the side that you can't ignore, really.
Yeah.
Like that they're the,
Yeah.
and it really makes me, particularly given this conversation and probably actually all of the conversations, the examples you gave, whether it be psychedelics or that, mountaineering or midwifery, these are actually like ancient, not even skills, but like in our blood and bones, in our DNA. It's only in our kind of modern
Yeah.
culture that we've decided, oh, they need to have these kind of training and this kind of accreditation. And then we've made it like all about that. And forget they're like, no, these are human birthrights. Like this is just
Yeah.
crazy how we've just lost sight of that. So a couple of things I would love to explore. I guess first is the context all this is happening in. We were saying just before we started recording, it's like my experience has been much more on the shamanic side of things, but similar conversations are happening, albeit from a different side, kind of coming from a different place. But ultimately, this is all happening within a bigger backdrop of, this renewed interest in psychedelics, which by its very nature is then, and then I guess the reason that this training program began is then asking for more people to be able to act as guides. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of, I guess, both from a kind of cognitive perspective, but also everything else that's at play. Like, what do you see? Like, why is this happening now? What do you feel that this is, reflecting for us as a culture? And then I think I would like to spend a bit more time looking at this kind of, what really allows us to know that we're ready. Because certainly there's a very different view from a shamanic perspective to kind of like what our modern culture says. And I feel like the answer needs to take in all of that. But let's start with the context this is happening in.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay. There's so much to say about this fascinating, like rapidly changing, almost like kind of public obsession that there is at the moment with psychedelics. I think you mentioned this before we started recording, but kind of like, I think there's a sense that like the plants, the mushroom are agents, right? And they're participants in this coming about, which I think is so interesting to lean into. But yeah, we're looking at, expanding legal access. We're looking at this whole influx of research from, prestigious academic institutions that are becoming fascinated by the research that's available here. There's all kinds of opportunities opening up, conferences, retreat centers. Like this is kind of explosive. And it really begs a very, very careful examination of a number of things. And I've been in such rich conversations with people who are kind of examining this from like an ethical perspective. Like, Kylia Taylor is kind of a big name in the field of sort of like thinking about ethical ramifications of the speed with which this is changing. I'm thinking about people who are kind of on the front line of research, like Dr. Tony Bach and Roz Watts, and others who are reflecting on the field from the perspective of researchers and of these studies and what we're learning. A man named Alex Belzner has done really interesting work looking at how kind of sociologically, like he has a book called The Queering of Psychedelics, and kind of thinking about how different communities are being uniquely affected and impacted by this resurgence. And then lots of people who are like, we're calling it a renaissance and a resurgence. And even that's really like a misnomer, right? Because this has been going on for really quite a long time. But there's undeniably like a public fascination with this. And I think maybe the angle I find richest is one that I've had the privilege of getting into with a colleague down in Peru named Claude Ghislaine, who's a Peruvian anthropologist, and he calls himself a bridge keeper, meaning he's sort of like a holder, a maintainer of the bridge between a lot of indigenous psychedelic practitioners, workers, facilitators, communities, and then the West, with whom he identifies. And he's really, I'm so grateful for the way that he's brought to my attention and that of our learning community, the way in which this is being often understood or perceived on the part of his friends and colleagues in indigenous communities in the Amazon. So he will often remind us all over and over and over again of the like indigenous origins of all of these medicines, of most of these medicines that we're calling psychedelics, and the historical debt that the West has with indigenous civilization. So all this like fascination and this interest, this renaissance from the West with psychedelics is kind of like the alternative for like this great failure of modern science, which is this, mental health crisis that we find ourselves in. From the perspective of some indigenous communities, this fascination is kind of seen as yet another manifestation of abuse, of theft, of complete disregard of their culture, their rights, and their importance as part of the human family. So like another way of putting it is, for some of these communities, this whole renaissance that we're celebrating and exciting about is something that needs to, like, on the one hand, maybe needs to be resisted, right? As something that needs to be recognized as yet another way in which it is extracting like the most sacred medicine, being taken out of its context without any real acknowledgement of all the knowledge that's been accumulated for generations and generations. And so and then I think that's on the one hand. And then I think there also is this real like embrace of like, yes, indeed, there is real possibility for healing our civilization from the disconnect, from the trauma, from the civilizational drama, from our disconnection from nature. But I think that it's often happening with a real like just erasure, ignoring, disregard for the fact that like this is held as possibly the most sacred thing for communities who have been like stewarding it for many, 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 many years. So yeah. Anyway, that's one of the many angles that we can approach a conversation about what's going on today from.
I really appreciate you for bringing this, because I think it's intrinsically linked and really kind of needs to be part of any conversation we're having. I feel so fortunate that my own shamanic lineage is British, and we work with this land. There's obviously, a lot, it's a lost lineage, and yet it's still here in the land and the medicine of the land. And we're extremely fortunate that we have a ongoing kind of very reciprocal relationship with indigenous shamans in the Viracocha in Mexico, who have a completely different medicine. They work with the peyote. And yet they've been so generous in the sharing of their wisdom, their ancient ways, but all with the intention of us being in the reclamation of what it means for, to be on this land, on the British land. And because that relationship is like very conscious, very reciprocal, they've chosen, they actually came to Britain with that intention to share their wisdom, because it was what they were being shown was being asked for. And it's kind of like that reciprocal exchange is so built into the relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what we're like that's happening at a material level, but I think, energetically, metaphorically, one way or another, that needs to be present in any relationship that we're creating with the medicine, and particularly when it is medicine that belongs to another land and to people who have, died to keep it alive.
Yeah. I mean, that idea of reciprocity, like that's just not very strong in like the Western discourse, is it? Like, we're not really used to thinking about like an exchange, right? Like a giving and a receiving. I think we're just so primed. I say us, I'm speaking of like those immersed in like modern Western discourses of like, how can I take? What can I get? And it gets at this, like, this is the disconnection consciousness from our relationship to the natural world that I alluded to earlier on. Is it just seems like it's so inherently extractive. How is this world a collection of resources? I think it was Thomas Berry who was inviting us to think of it not as like a collection of objects, but a community of subjects with whom we are in relationship, we can be in relationship. And, one of many things that I think a psychedelic experience can open up is that sense of the other than human world, the non-human world, as a community of subjects with whom we are a part. We're, interdependent. And sometimes that can make so much more progress towards addressing the disconnect than years and years and years of studying how, I've gone back to like do deep exegesis of the book of Genesis and understand like the origins of our relationship with the world, and the so-called command from God to have dominion over it. Like, I've studied that for so long. It's all there in my brain. And I can like disagree with it, right? And critique it and disapprove of it and recognize the impacts of it. But until it's like in my body, right? Until I am like grieving in my body that disconnection, I don't think it's going to be particularly effective. Until I'm communing in an intimate way with the natural world, until I'm engaged in my own like rewilding, I don't. And so once again, it's sort of like, I think there's a lot of pathways to get to this. I imagine you speak to all kinds of people who are opening up these beautiful pathways. And for me, here's like one of them, right? It's not a panacea. It's not this golden pill. It's not the solution to all of our problems, but it's a really, really interesting tool that's like opening back up to us now in this time when perhaps we really need it.
Yeah, I really love that. I'm just going to say one final thing about that you were mentioning about, we really, as a culture, we've just lost that, again, I think very human way of being, which is reciprocal. And one of the most kind of foundational and most precious of learnings I've taken from my shamanic teaching, which again very much has been infused by the indigenous Mexican teachings, is that practice of making offerings. And that being just a sort of centerpiece of your life, that you just wouldn't even think of being in the world without an offerings practice. An offering, certainly if you're working with a plant teacher, but making offerings to the land, offering to whatever spirit helpers you're working with. And that is almost like a worldview shift in itself. And it's like, once we've shifted to that worldview, it's actually harder to kind of like remember back how we used to be in relationship in this way, where it's like just take.
Yes.
And I think, again, it's worth recognizing, I think, as far as I know, whilst not wanting to kind of homogenize all the different practices across the world, I think we'd probably struggle to find cultures without some form of offerings practice, particularly those that work with plant teachers.
Yes. I think that's spot on. And I'm so glad to hear that that's a practice that's being cultivated in your lineage. And it's making me wonder actually if I don't know that we get into that very much in our particular training. I think a little bit towards the end, we have this final module called the life of service. And we really invite people to think like, okay, you've reached the end of this rich training. You've taken in context, you've been in these pod groups that have, formed these little communities that are going through, there's all these embodied practices throughout the whole process. And now here you are at the end and like, what do you, what will you do now? And like, what's your offering? What is your offering now to the world, rather than like, okay, I got my piece of paper, I'm ready to go. But like, what will be the nature of your relationship with the work and with this community from now on? This makes me think of something else that I'd been like mulling over in preparing for this, which is like the different, a couple different ways in which one might think about when and how they're like ready to do this work, or that this, going back to like calling. Before I was working in the field of psychedelics, I was working for with a network of spiritual directors or spiritual companions. And I don't know if this term is one that you or listeners are familiar with. This is the idea is that these are people who help others grow spiritually, usually in one-on-one work. It can look like therapy. It doesn't necessarily, but it's this kind of art, this craft of like listening and helping someone discern where and how they're growing spiritually, whatever that means to them. And just like diving into the big questions, like, do you believe in God? What's your relationship to God? If not, like, how do you name this? Big like meaning of life questions. Why am I here? What does it mean to be alive? And this has been manifested across all religious traditions across history, but it's got a particularly rich history in the Catholic tradition. And it kind of I think it emerged out of Vatican II. And it was a way for nuns and lay women to kind of stake a claim in, like, we've got a role to play as well in helping people like along the spiritual journey. And so it's got some like really rich roots there. But an interesting thing about spiritual direction or spiritual companionship is there is no overarching certifying body for spiritual directors. Like, there are formation training programs, and they each have their own certification process, and they can be really rigorous. But nobody comes in and audits it and says, like, you're legit or you're not, because this is understood as a charism, as a gift of the spirit. Like, you get it from God, and you either have it or you don't. Like, so like, who is that? What are you going to have an organization come in here and be like, you're a spiritual director, you're ready to do this work? And I think that like a classic response would be like, I have a gift that has come from like beyond, and I'm going to honor, like, I'm stepping into that, and I don't need a piece of paper to tell me that I'm ready to do it, which makes for a very, very, very interesting conversation when you also transpose this into a realm of like, how do we ensure that people are behaving ethically? How do we ensure that like there's best practices going on? Like, what kind of oversight is needed? So I find it really interesting to think about like, yeah, so that's one example, right? Is like, I am getting like the divine source or God is like the source of me feeling qualified to step into this work. Another way of thinking about it is like, is there a community that is trusting and accepting a healer and that healer's judgment, because that particular person went through a training process that was embedded in community? And so rather than like a diploma or a certificate from a course, like, there's a group of people who are recognizing and being like, you are a healer and we choose you to participate in like the healing work of our community. So I think, many shamans and healers are the holders of the accumulation of knowledge gained from like millennia of communication with the spirit world. It's like scientists in a different sense of the word. And so in that sense, it's like, I don't need the piece of paper because I have this group of people that has bestowed this privilege on me. And I guess maybe a third way to think about it, and this is something that we conscientiously invite at the end of the course, is like, we have this module on screening, and it's my favorite one because it looks at screening not as a science, but as an art. And one that's like evolving and changing. And it also is like, we have the sense of like, I need to screen my client to make sure that they're ready to take this substance, right? They don't have like contraindications medically, like they've got the support system, all the different things you consider in screening. But there's also this invitation to like, you got to screen yourself. So there's also this like, I need to be screening myself for my own readiness, like turn the gaze inward and be like, I need to be screened before I step into this work. Maybe every time before I step into ceremony, like, am I ready? Am I prepared?
Oh, I love this so much. What was just, I don't know if it's possibly too early for you to answer this, but I'm going to ask you anyway, just to see what you've seen so far. So I was just reflecting on that question of readiness, and in my shamanic lineage, I think it's something like only probably about 10% of people who go through the training. And just for some context, it's like 3 years minimum of very hard initiatory training. So it's not something you just do on a whim. And only 10% roughly at the end of that will go on to practice. So quite a small percentage, particularly given how kind of like deeply you must feel called to even embark on it in the first place. And as Jez Hughes, my teacher, says, this is probably his catchphrase actually, but specifically with things like, it's between people and spirit. Like spirit will let them know if they are ready, not ready, if they're actually ever meant to practice. Perhaps that wasn't the intention. Perhaps it was to have the experience of going through those initiations, but not necessarily to then practice shamanically. And so all of this is kind of like, I find this so fascinating, because this is so beyond the realms of like what we can kind of, we can't measure that readiness if it is between us and spirit. It is, is there or not. So I'd love to know, from what you've seen so far with people going through your training, do you know what percentage are then going on to practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've had one cohort, full cohort complete. We just graduated another small cohort, and we're going to have, more wrapping up in about 3 months, and then more in about 6 months. So we're gathering this, the data on this. And it's imperfect and it's somewhat anecdotal, and it varies so much depending on like what location are people in. Are they committed to operating legally above ground or not? Are they continuing to work with psilocybin? Are they expanding to other plants that weren't, necessarily like featured as the focus in this training program? And then, do they have a clinical background, and are they going into kind of a research? Are they going into retreat spaces? Are they going into harm reduction spaces? Are they going to like festival? Like there's so many different spaces where this could show up. Are they integrating it back into other modalities or practices like body work or like coaching or therapy? Like there's just a lot of different expressions for how this can show up. But I will just speak to the incredible pressure that there is in this field for there to be like employment, like lucrative employment. Like if I could just pay for this program, then at the other end, then I can start to do the work and I can practice and start to make money. And that's very real. And it is a huge tension. It's a huge tension in the space. I remember I went into an ayahuasca ceremony recently, and I was talking to the guide, to the shaman in the beginning, and I shared a little bit about the work that I do. And I was like, I'm so new, like I'm really just beginning. And he's been doing this for 30 years or so. And he said, me too. Like I'm just beginning. I'm just getting into this now. And he like meant it. And I appreciated so much this recognition of like, gosh, you could do this for a lifetime and be just getting ready, just beginning, just starting out. And boy, I mean, we don't operate in a world that's very generous about that sort of thing. It just really wants to kind of churn out like, here, you did the course, you got your degree, you're ready to go. And just express gratitude for the voices that are feeling really compelled to like trouble those waters and just think a little bit more critically about readiness and about preparedness and about the amount of time it takes to develop your own relationship with this plant, to do the own inner healing work you've got to do if you're going to guide other people along this, to really kind of like cultivate some somatic practices, right? Because it's in the end, it's really not just about like having knowledge in your brain. It's about and it takes a lot of time. Kylie Taylor talks about this all the time. She's like, it takes a lot of time to do this right and to do it well and to do it responsibly. And that's not something we can just like sign up for a course and you'll get more time in your life so that you can pack this in and start, doing this sooner. It just takes time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it feels just so unintuitive to the way that we've set everything up in our modern culture, where it's like, how can we make this like efficient, productive, move from A to B as quickly as possible? And it just seems to me the more we try and push in that direction with this, actually we aren't honoring what's really being asked of us.
Yeah.
And that's like inconvenient. It's like really inconvenient.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it seems to me what the truth is.
Yeah. There's this amazing Nigerian philosopher, psychiatrist, poet named Bayo Komolafe, who I've been able to work with for a couple of years. And Bayo has this one thing, it's kind of been like distilled into like his soundbite, and there's so much more to like his thinking and sharing and teaching than this, but it's really powerful. He says, the times are urgent. We have to slow down. And I hear that like requoted all the time, all over the place, because I think it's really like landing. Folks are like, yeah, there's like crises going on all around us. It's super urgent. We need to slow down.
Oh,
Let's all slow down.
What a perfect way to bring this episode to a close. Oh my goodness, this has been just so delightful. Thank you so much. Where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful work?
Oh, thank you for that offer. So if folks are kind of intrigued by this training program with Synthesis, we do have a training program website that spells out a little bit more about what we do. And I'm going to ask you, Liam, if you can just link to that in the show notes, because I don't know it right off the top of my head. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a website. I feel like maybe I need to get one, but I don't know. I'm on LinkedIn, Frederica Helmiere. I'd love to connect with anyone who wants to connect with me.
Oh, yes. We'll make sure anything that you want us to add to the show notes, we'll do that. So listen, we'll have to find out all about where they can, potentially join your programs. Thank you so much. This has been truly delightful conversation. Really appreciate it.
Likewise. Likewise. Thank you for the chance to be here.
Thank you.